Welcome, everyone, to Radical Thought and Political Resistance in the English Civil Wars with historian Rachel Foxley from the University of Reading. I'm Sarah Stewart of the Partnership of Historic Bostons, and this is the fourth and last in our series on revolutions before the revolution. It is also the last event of the year. So you might be relieved, but we're tired. This presentation came about because the topic is just very exciting and new, I think really new to most people in the United States and even people in England. And B, because we wanted to be able to say the ideas that we associate with the American Revolution, equality under the law, a broader franchise, all these things actually happened long ago. That this year, 1775, 2025 was the 250th anniversary of the outbreak of war at Lexington and Concord here in New England. And so it was a big year. Next year, 2026, will be the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And it's going to be a widely acclaimed moment with films, events, fanfare, and so forth. But we wanted to say, think again. This is not, we cannot claim American, what's the word I want, sort of an American privilege with this, because the democratic ideas we usually ascribe to the revolution go back a long way. It's not a straight line, but there is a link between the ideas of 17th century England and 1776 colonial America, and even today. So what you'll see this evening, what you'll hear from Rachel, is that in the 1640s, radical thinkers in England argued for wider rights, representation, a republic, and these ideas helped to shape the intellectual and political environment out of which emerged the execution of a king, Cromwell's England, and New England's Puritans. So tonight we will address the question of how did parliamentarians, how did levelers justify these extreme steps and their political and military resistance? What ideas did they draw on? And what were their thoughts about law and the ancient origins of government? So first, I want to say a little bit about Rachel Foxley, who you're hearing from this evening. She is Associate Professor in Early Modern History at the University of Reading in Britain. She is the author of a book called The Levelers, Radical Political Thought in the English Revolution, and of numerous articles and chapters on the radicals and republicans of the period. Her book, The Levelers, traces the origins of their ideas in parliamentary thought during the Civil War and asks how far leveler ideas fed into discussions of republicanism after the execution of Charles I, which is, I need to order this book personally. I've been remiss not in doing it, but it's going to be fascinating. She's currently working on a book about English Republicans of the 1650s and their negotiations with ideas of democracy. As always, Rachel will present for about 50 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. So the practice is write your questions into the chat as they occur to you as we go along, and you can always ask them at the end, but we'll pick them up at the end of the presentation. So just ask, as they come up in your mind, just throw them in there, and we'll get to them. We'll get to them all if we can. So, of course, remember that this presentation is being recorded. We will tomorrow send you the link to that recording along with the survey, which we hope you will take. So now I'm handing over to Rachel, and thank you, Rachel, for being with us, especially since it is 10:30 at night in the UK.
Thank you, Sarah. So I hope I haven't tried to pack too much into this presentation, but if I just skip over something too quickly that you want me to say more about, you can always come back to it in the questions. So in the English Revolution of the 1640s, the English Parliament waged war on their own king, Charles I, who you see here. This was an extraordinary development, not least because the necessity of obedience to authority was drummed into the people constantly in early modern England, including from...
Rachel, sorry to interrupt, but I think your slides aren't coming up.
There should be more text on the slide. Is that not?
I am seeing them, Sarah. You should
Okay.
Double check your Zoom. Sorry.
Sorry about that.
Okay, well, let me know if there's a problem. So obedience was preached to people literally from the pulpits, including in the government-approved homily on obedience. And this dwelled on the natural hierarchy binding the nation and indeed the universe together, and the terrible disorder and destruction that would follow if disobedience to superiors became prevalent. One small detail about the Civil War, I think, brings home the pervasive reach of this teaching on obedience. In the civil wars, military troops and companies had their own flags, with designs which often symbolized what they thought they were fighting for. The designs of many of these have been preserved, so we know that one royalist unit went into battle with a flag which simply bore the words Romans 13. And they didn't need to say any more than that because everyone knew what Romans 13, that chapter in the Bible, actually said. It's the most famous biblical text on obedience. It's the one that says the powers that be are ordained of God. So to the royalists, it was obvious that Scripture and indeed God were on their side, and that the parliamentarians fighting their own anointed king were simply sinful rebels. And yet the English Civil War did happen, and indeed it developed into what was undeniably a revolution, with the execution of Charles I in 1649, followed by the abolition of monarchy and the institution of a republic. So if England was steeped in these ideas of political hierarchy and political obedience, how was it possible for a parliament to fight their own king who had summoned them? And more importantly for this talk, how could they justify doing that? So in this talk, I'm going to give a little background to the English Revolution and suggest some reasons why this resistance, although it is still really remarkable, is slightly less surprising than it might appear at first glance. Then I'll talk about how radical ideas developed further as the revolution proceeded in a process of escalation and radicalization, and I'll focus particularly on the ideas of the Levellers, an extraordinary radical movement which coalesced in the later 1640s and the years leading up to the execution of the king. In the final section of my talk, I'll talk briefly about the Republican writings which flowered after the execution of Charles I in 1649, when England became for the only time in its history a republic. The propagandists of that republic adopted some of the radical ideas of the Levellers, but arguably retreated from radicalism in other respects. Once Oliver Cromwell was installed as Lord Protector, he was a target for Republicans lamenting the threat of renewed monarchy. And of course, they were worried about the House of Cromwell rather than the House of Stuart at that point. But in 1660, the Republicans' even greater fear was realised when, after Cromwell's death, Charles II reclaimed his father's throne for the Stuarts. So that's the background, and I'll move on to talk about the broader background that came before the Civil War. And I know for those of you who came to the last talk, Frank Bremer talked a little bit about this as well. So Charles I had been on the throne since 1625. And at the end of his reign, he was to end up charged with high treason and executed after being defeated in 2 civil wars. But at the start of his reign, he wasn't immediately unpopular. And that was partly because he was leading a new direction in foreign policy, aligning England with Protestant forces on the continent at the start of the 30 Years' War. And from this slide, you can see the monumental scale that some of these battles in the 30 Years' War were being fought at. And one of England's problems is it absolutely did not have the military capacity to get very seriously involved in this kind of warfare at this time. But there was very strong public feeling in England that they should get involved, both because of England's now firm Protestant identity and because Charles I's sister, Elizabeth, had made a Protestant marriage to the key figure in the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, Frederick, the Elector Palatine. They were now both Protestant refugees on the continent, and there was a really strong feeling that England should be coming to their aid militarily. So Charles, at the start of his reign, is kind of surfing a wave of popular feeling and is actually enjoying that sensation of doing something that people actually want him to do, taking England into the war. But that set off a chain of events which led to a major political crisis in 1628, 1629, and subsequently to the English Revolution, which began in 1640. And this is because fighting wars required parliaments to meet frequently because taxes had to be raised in order to fight the war. And so Charles is holding frequent parliaments at the start of his reign, something we often forget. However, the English expeditions to the continent were disasters. They were very expensive. They imposed huge burdens on the English population, which people were very soon sick of. And the legality of some of these taxes, obligations, and loans was questioned both in and outside Parliament. And it didn't help that the Duke of Buckingham, who you see here, Charles's increasingly unpopular favourite, was in charge of the Admiralty. He came under political attack in successive parliaments, seriously undermining Charles's ability to work constructively with parliaments at all. And that again made financial issues worse. After dissolving his 1626 parliament to protect Buckingham from its attacks, Charles I levied a forced loan instead of the parliamentary subsidy that he had hoped to collect. And some of those who refused to pay were imprisoned without cause shown, simply by command of the king rather than for breaking any specified law. And although that was ruled legal in a test case, it was seen as a gross violation of the subject's liberties. In parallel to all that, Charles was increasingly steering the Church of England in a direction which raised fears about his real religious allegiances. He was promoting and protecting high church clergymen who were anathema to the Puritan wing of the church, and the policies of the church changed accordingly. So all of these issues were causing conflict in the frequent parliaments that he was being forced to call. So how did all of this disquiet relate to the assumptions of hierarchy and obedience, which I outlined at the start? On what grounds could people voice their opposition to these royal policies? I'm going to talk about two traditions of thought that are important here, starting with the ancient constitution and the common law. Legal thinking was hugely important in English political culture at this time. Numbers of lawyers were proliferating, much to the disgust of people who felt that they were money grubbing and exploitative. Early modern society was extremely litigious. But at a higher level, men like this man, Sir Edward Coke, the most famous common lawyer of the age, made the law central to politics as well. Coke had risen to high judicial office before angering James I with his trenchant views on the relationship of the king to the law. After losing office, he returned to Parliament as an MP in several parliaments and played a prominent role there in the 1620s, increasingly as a critic of royal policy. So people like Coke argued strongly that the common law governed the king, and controversial royal policies could be tested in the law courts. And common law had this great flexibility, particularly in the hands of someone like Coke. While statute law was the law made by king, lords, and commons in Parliament, the common law was seen as something wider, a web of judge-made precedents and customs, which those who practiced the law saw as originating time out of mind ago. So these immemorial customs were enshrined in law, and that meant they couldn't be undone by ambitious kings who came along later, even if they could get legislation through Parliament. So there's an ancient constitution, readable through layers of recorded historical and legal precedent. And in practice, all the parliamentary statutes that are favourable to your case, you also cite those in support of this being the ancient constitution. So in this mindset, the king was very definitely not above the law, but was bound by the law. And the ancient constitution was seen to guarantee certain liberties to the subject, certain privileges to Parliament, and certain prerogatives to the king as well. So how did you find out the content of these liberties? Well, various texts, including, of course, Magna Carta, were frequently referenced. And Magna Carta had been ratified as a statute in 1225, so that was also useful. Kings had actually put it on the statute book, parliaments had. Coke rated Magna Carta highly, and he interpreted it the significance of it very generously. And his edition of it was published in 1642 as part of his vast legal works after his death, and it's published by order of the Long Parliament, which was about to fight Charles I. This is not a coincidence. They reclaim his papers that have been seized by the king, and they put it out because it helps their cause. So for Coke, Magna Carta was very much greater than the sum of its parts, as we can see from his account of why it's called Magna Carta, why it's called the Great Charter. And I think this is really sweet, the comparison he makes here. He says it's called Magna Carta, not that it is great in quantity, but in respect of the great importance and weightiness of the matter. King Alexander, Alexander the Great, was called Alexander the Great not in respect of the largeness of his body, for he was a little man, but in respect of the greatness of his heroical spirit. And Coke clearly thinks that Magna Carta, although quite a short document, has the same kind of heroical spirit. And as you can see, he goes on to say, it's called the Charter of the Liberties of the Realm because it makes men free. It just makes us free. So it's not about a series of particular provisions. It has this broader kind of significance for Coke, and it, again, can be called common liberty because it represents something much bigger than a list of particular provisions. So the implication of this ancient web of liberties was that Englishmen were free, and that meant that the king did not have absolute power over them. And in the crisis of the later 1620s, in which Coke was involved as an MP, he stated, "I know that the king's prerogative is part of the law, but sovereign power is no parliamentary word. In my opinion, it weakens Magna Carta. Magna Carta is such a fellow that he will have no sovereign." As the threat to the rule of law posed by royal policies grew in the 1620s and political discontent mounted, Coke proposed a novel expedient. This was the Petition of Right of 1628, a parliamentary bill which stated that much of what Charles's government had been doing was in fact illegal. And the Petition of Right cited Magna Carta and other ancient statutes in defence of the principles that taxation had to be approved by Parliament and that imprisonment and punishment had to be by due process of law. And that put Charles in a difficult position because he was being asked to confirm things which were already arguably the law of the land, but also the document had been very explicit about the fact that he had not been acting accordingly. And he tried to evade giving a formal answer, but eventually was forced to give a formal answer, which put the Petition of Right also on the statute book and made it part of this tradition of documents that people could appeal to. So the law was a very powerful language for arguing for limits on the king's power. Now, the trouble that Coke and others had made for the king in Parliament in 1628, 1629 had momentous consequences. Charles decided not to hold another Parliament until he was more persuaded that his subjects in Parliament would behave themselves, and ended up not calling another Parliament until 1640, ruling for a decade without a Parliament in England, a period called his personal rule, during which he had to turn to yet more dubious financial expedients to keep the show on the road. And on the face of it, this was a peaceful period, and it's the period that generates these beautiful Van Dyck paintings. The court culture of the 1630s is very magnificent. But the lack of a parliament must have been deeply felt. As Noah Millstone has shown, the dismissive revisionist idea that Parliament in early modern England was an event and not an institution fails to account for the deep attachment of the political nation to the idea that Parliament was the place to resolve grievances, and in times of trouble, you have to call a Parliament. So the personal rule was a serious problem, and Parliament was a really crucial part of the ancient constitution. So the ancient constitution is one language of resistance, but there's also a more abstract and international set of arguments that were available to be drawn on. And that is a set of arguments that we call resistance theory. Now, this had Catholic origins, but in the 16th century, various newly Protestant groups across Europe used it to justify resisting Catholic rulers, including English Protestants using it against Mary Tudor, Scottish Protestants using it against Mary Queen of Scots, and the French Huguenots also developing resistance literature. So a canon of literature justifying resistance had been created that in the 17th century could be drawn on. Resistance theory tended to start from the point that obedience to kings was always under God. If a king commanded you to do something against the law of God, you should refuse. You should suffer the consequences, but you should refuse to actually act against the law of God. But from that basic starting point, it expanded into a broader theory of resistance against tyrants, drawing on natural law and ancient ideas to argue that it is lawful to depose an evil governor and kill a tyrant. Ideas of original liberty and of a natural drive for self-preservation were used to argue both that the original founders of states and governments would have built in constitutional protections against tyranny that could now be exercised, and also that no one should really suffer themselves to be destroyed by a bad ruler in the present. It goes against this idea of self-preservation. Some of these resistance theories were quite hedged around with cautions. They made distinctions between resistance by lesser magistrates and legitimate parts of the constitutional machinery versus resistance by the people or private individuals, which might not be legitimate, or they made distinctions between legitimate kings versus usurpers who could more easily be resisted. But other theorists made remarkably far-reaching arguments, justifying the right even of private individuals to assassinate a tyrant. And the Stuart monarchs were very, very well aware of the existence of these theories, because Charles I's father, James VI of Scotland, James I of England, had actually been tutored in his childhood by George Buchanan, who you see here, who was one of the more extreme Scottish resistance theorists who had been publishing in the reign of his mother, Mary. And we can hypothesize, I think, that a lot of the emphasis placed by James I and Charles I on non-resistance and the divine right of kings was precisely intended to counter these very well-developed and well-known arguments in favour of resistance. James and Charles really hated these arguments. And as the English Revolution eventually showed, they were right to be afraid. So I'll now move on to the Civil War itself, the English Revolution itself, and talk about parliamentarian resistance. Various crises brought the personal rule of Charles I in the 1630s to an end by 1640. Rebellions in Scotland from 1637 and Ireland in 1641 shook the Stuart monarchy, and the king needed the support of an English parliament if he was to address these rebellions militarily. But when the English parliament met, all the unexpressed grievances of the past 11 years without a parliament came surging out. It was only through the pressure of external circumstance that Charles was forced not just to call, but to keep in existence the Long Parliament, which was to fight him. The Scottish rebels insisted on it as a precondition of negotiations with them. But the level of discontent in England was very quickly laid bare. Charles did make enough concessions to build a royalist party who would actually fight for him, which was no small achievement under the circumstances, but it wasn't enough for the majority of the House of Commons, who didn't trust Charles and who, with their allies in the Lords, would end up leading the war effort against him on behalf of Parliament. Civil wars between King and Parliament raged from 1642 to 1646, and again in 1648, but Charles was defeated both times. It was resistance theory that furnished Parliament's justifications for resisting Charles I, alongside the understanding that the English Parliament was a part of the ancient constitution and perhaps could be seen as a lesser magistrate which could step in to hold the king to account and indeed to perform some of his functions once he had, as parliamentarians saw it, abandoned his capital and his parliament before the start of the war. A very vigorous print culture sprang up to offer propaganda on both sides, and the ideas on both sides were boiled down into quite digestible forms for a broader audience, such as two rival catechisms, borrowing the term from religious texts of instructing people in the basics of religion. And so there are two rival catechisms that are published, one on the royalist side, one on the parliamentarian side, intended to tell the soldiers themselves why their cause was just. So in the royalist catechism, which you see here, the soldiers are asked what they think. Royalist soldiers are asked what they think of parliamentarians, and in their scripted reply, they say the parliamentarians are rebels, they will be punished with damnation. And they cite Romans 13 in their answers as well. Then they are pressed further about whether there are any circumstances under which it would be at all right to rebel against a king. So this is the second arrow. Sir, may not subjects resist their king in any case, though he be a heretic, an apostate, or a tyrant? And the answer is no, subjects may not resist in any case. This is the doctrine of Jesuits and Puritans. So this royalist text for a popular audience shows us exactly what royalists thought of resistance theory, which had indeed been developed by Catholics and then by Puritans in the 16th century, and was still strongly associated with both in the royalist imagination. It was a good way of dismissing it. So how did the parliamentarian soldiers' catechism answer this kind of condemnation of resistance? And it tackles the question head on. You cannot avoid Romans 13. So it says, how can you that are soldiers for the parliament answer that place of Paul, Romans 13, chapters 1, 2, verses 1, 2, 3, etc. And they give three different answers. So firstly, you shouldn't obey unlawful commands. We are no further to obey man than may stand with the will of God. Then the biblical text talks about the highest powers, but this argues that they are mistaken, which say that the king is the highest power. He is the highest person in his dominions, but the laws and courts are above him in power, and the king himself is limited and subject to the meanest court in the land. Therefore, surely the High Court of Parliament must needs be the higher power, which not to obey is to resist the ordinance of God. And then thirdly, suppose the king were the higher power, yet if he shall intend or permit the ruin of his subjects, both nature and grace allows people to preserve themselves. In other words, parliamentarian soldiers are being given a lesson in the various strands of resistance theory. It's a radical lesson in that it even questions whether the king is the highest power in the land, but it's a less radical one in that it roots the authority for resistance in Parliament and doesn't justify people to act independently. There were also longer and more theoretical parliamentarian texts, like those of the leading parliamentarian propagandist Henry Parker. These kinds of texts built on the natural law tradition of originally Catholic thought, which underpinned much of resistance theory. So there's a kind of framework of ideas here that is common to a lot of parliamentarian thinking. So they say people had originally been free and equal. In that state of nature, people had decided that government would be useful, they'd consented to be ruled, then made some kind of conditional contract or trust with their rulers. And no power which originated without that consent was legitimate. And because people naturally had a desire for self-preservation, they would never have made contracts which endangered themselves. For many mainstream parliamentarian authors, such arguments proved that way back in the mists of time, safeguards, particularly Parliament itself, had already been included in the Constitution to prevent the power of kings becoming excessive or dangerous. That was why Parliament, as a lesser magistrate, could now lead resistance against the king. So it all fits in nicely with discussion of the ancient Constitution of England and the safeguards that it must contain. In Henry Parker's hands, this kind of theory led to a strong emphasis on the power of Parliament itself, and his thought has been described as a kind of parliamentary absolutism, in which the absolute power of the king is replaced by the absolute power of Parliament. And that's enabled by his identification of Parliament's power with the people's power. So in Parker's view, Parliament, in representing the people, couldn't help but act in the people's best interests. Parliament simply can't harm the people. It's just kind of constitutionally impossible because Parliament represents the people. And this kind of parliamentary absolutism was also enabled by the way that he confined the people's act of trust in consenting to government to the distant past. The people's original power was now safely contained in Parliament within the Constitution, and Parliament's acts were the people's acts. So the people was not an independent force which could challenge Parliament itself. But some within the parliamentarian camp soon felt that Parliament too did need resisting and found different ways of using these same arguments to justify that. So this is where we come on to the Levellers and the radicalisation of the English Revolution. Now, I think parliamentarian arguments for resistance had been actually quite radical, but Parliament's official line politically continued to be that it was not fighting the king himself, but rather his evil councillors. And almost throughout the civil wars and in their aftermath, Parliament was negotiating with Charles I to put him back on the throne. But the parliamentarian side was not a monolith, it was a coalition, and it was an increasingly fractious and divided coalition. And what we see through the 1640s is a process of ideological escalation and radicalisation, which ultimately led radical parliamentarians to challenge the authority not just of the king, but of the parliament too, and to propose radical changes to the constitution. The Levellers, alongside supporters and allies in the Parliament's new model army, were the most visible and organised radicals of the 1640s. Flourishing from 1646, at the point when Parliament won the First Civil War, through the turbulent years until 1649, when Charles I was put on trial and executed, they were a pressure group who put forward a much more radical settlement proposal than parliamentarian leaders could stomach. And certainly one that was not compatible with putting Charles I back on the throne. He would never have consented to be part of a constitution like this, even if it had allowed a place for him. Although the Levellers' constitutional ideas weren't implemented, the radical ideas they worked out were very influential in the campaigns which ultimately enabled this very unlikely outcome of regicide and republic to become a reality. So who were the Levellers? The movement was led by three radical pamphleteers of differing backgrounds: John Lilburne, who you see on the left, William Wallin, and Richard Overton, for whom we don't have a portrait. They began to come together from 1645, at the point when it was apparent that Parliament was going to win the war. They were all fervent parliamentarians, men who had believed from the start that the war should be fought aggressively to gain maximum traction over the king in any settlement. They also all believed in freedom of conscience in religion, and although their personal religious beliefs were rather different from each other, they all belonged to the Puritan and Congregationalist fringe, which had been able to emerge and separate from the national church in the disruption of the Civil War years. All three were also talented pamphleteers, able to make full use of the market for cheap, topical, sometimes satirical print, which had exploded in the Civil War years with the initial breakdown of censorship. They were also quite different characters, as I think you can even see from the portraits here. John Lilburne, in his mid-20s at the outbreak of the war, was a charismatic rabble-rouser who made as many enemies as friends throughout his career. He'd already had his first taste of prison because he'd been smuggling Puritan pamphlets which lambasted the bishops of the Church of England. And his religious, legal, and political knowledge was largely self-taught and acquired through the networks of godly apprentices which he moved in. He was argumentative, he was earnest, he was persistent. His writings were incredibly repetitive, but they were also very, very effective. He often used his own case as an example of the oppression inflicted by Parliament upon freeborn Englishmen such as himself, and he spent much of the 1640s and indeed parts of the 1650s as well in prison on order of Parliament, even though he was a parliamentarian. William Wallin, as you can see, although this is a portrait from much later in his life, was older and more respectable. He was around 40 at the outbreak of the Civil War. He was a successful merchant. And he was a less public face in the Leveller movement, but made important contributions to their collective pamphlets, and also wrote wonderful satirical pamphlets himself against the enemies of religious freedom, which was a cause that he was entirely passionate about. He depicted himself as a peaceable soul who meant no harm to anyone, but his enemies were infuriated by that because they thought he was actually a very canny political operator, and this was a literary persona rather than the real Wallin. And Richard Overton, who I'm representing with this pamphlet on the right, as you can see, was perhaps the most witty, perhaps the most outrageous of the Leveller leaders in his pamphleteering. And this is the closest we have to a portrait of him in the person of a bull who's sitting writing and tossing a Presbyterian clergyman contemptuously over his shoulder. And this is from a sequence of pamphlets in which Overton, calling himself Martin Marpriest, attacked the new Puritan clergy of the Civil War as power-hungry and grasping, comparing them to their high church predecessors before the Civil War and saying they were no better, they had betrayed the cause of the Civil War. And a particularly interesting detail in this is the false imprint at the bottom. It doesn't tell you who and where really printed it, but it gives you a kind of mock version of a printer's imprint and says they're to be sold at his shop in Toleration Street at the sign of the Subject's Liberty, right opposite to Persecuting Court. So you can see some of Overton's satirical technique there and some of his key values. Again, he's a great defender of religious toleration. Well, pamphleteers were to a penny in the hubbub of the English Revolution. So what was distinctive about the Levellers and their message? They did succeed in becoming something more than just a small group of people issuing pamphlets. They became something like a more modern political movement. They drew their support particularly from the new gathered congregations, which had grown up on the Puritan fringe outside the national church, as well as finding a ready audience among more radical elements in the Parliament's new model army. Although we should take with a pinch of salt the kinds of hostile reports which said that the army was one Lilburne throughout and that soldiers were treating Lilburne's pamphlets like Holy Writ. The new model army had radicals in it, but it was never a uniformly radical body. The Levellers capitalised on media and political techniques, which had been stimulated by the polarisation of the civil wars. So both sides were using these techniques, but the Levellers used them with great commitment and conviction. So pamphleteering, organised mass petitioning, where they would gather, if they could, thousands of signatures to a printed petition and present it to Parliament, and making collective shows of strength on the street as well when they presented these petitions. They were also not above stirring up mutiny in the army. None of these tactics were ultimately successful. But one of the things that's really striking about their pamphlets is the fact that they're not looking for passive support from their readers and followers. They want their readers to become upstanding freeborn Englishmen who engage actively to defend their own liberties, and they're targeting a wide audience. The Leveller movement really does seem to have been unique in Europe in the early modern period in delivering a strongly egalitarian message to and through a concerted movement which mustered and really valued popular support. So let's see what they were saying. A good place to start is their Remonstrance of Many Thousand Citizens of 1646. This boldly proclaimed, "Whatever our forefathers were, or whatever they did or suffered or were enforced to yield unto, we are the men of the present age, and ought to be absolutely free from all kinds of exorbitancies, molestations, or arbitrary power." So in that bit of rhetoric, they seem to be asking for a fairly clean break from the past, a genuinely radical statement, although it's not quite as simple as that, as we'll see. Equally striking is the tone in which these pamphleteers address their MPs and what they have to say about their MPs' role. As you can see from this title page, which gives you also a nice portrait of Lilburne in prison, the liberty of the freeborn Englishman conferred on him by the House of Lords is the sarcastic caption to that picture. But as you can see from the title page on the right, the pamphlet is a remonstrance supposedly presented by thousands of people to their own House of Commons. Addressing their MPs within the text, the citizens insist, "We are your principals and you are agents." In other words, you, the MPs, work for us, the people, the electors. So the Levellers presented the election of MPs as a moment when power passed temporarily from the people to their representatives in an act of political consent. So in the remonstrance, they say, "We possessed you with the same power that was in ourselves." So it is the people's power that Parliament is exercising. But strikingly, they also argued that we might justly have done it ourselves without you, if we had thought it convenient, choosing you as persons whom we thought fitly qualified and faithful for avoiding some inconveniences. So they're saying they didn't need to elect MPs to take political action. It would have been legitimate for the people to use their own power directly rather than through representatives. It would just be rather inconvenient to try and do it that way. And what's more, they told their MPs that their power was but a power of trust, which is ever revocable. And they definitely meant this to sound menacing. They were very, very unhappy with the parliamentarian leadership by this point. This trenchant text condemned Parliament's lukewarm prosecution of the war and its continued deference to the king. So the Levellers, instead of arguing on the basis of a popular power which was safely confined within Parliament, on acts of political consent in the distant past, they made the power of the people present and real in the present day. The power of the Parliament was directly derived from that of the people who elected them, and could always be taken back by the people. And the people could, as they say on the title page here, call their MPs to account. As they grew into a coherent movement, the Levellers began to present specific demands for a post-war settlement. The fundamental basis of the Levellers' thought was the political equality of adult male Englishmen, and the fact that there were certain rights and liberties which these men could not be stripped of and could always exercise. All political power ultimately had to derive from these English citizens themselves, and all political authorities had to recognise that and be accountable to the people. For that reason, the Levellers' ideal constitution would look rather different from what was in place before the Civil War. There would be a single-chamber elected legislature, which they called the representative, so not a two-chamber parliament of Lords and Commons. And it looks very likely from most of their publications that there wouldn't even be a king or a House of Lords, but they tended not to say there will be no king or House of Lords. They tended to just not mention them. Certainly neither king nor lords, if they survived, would have a veto on legislation. They were entirely clear that only this single chamber, directly elected representative, could legislate. Any king who did survive would have to be a mere executive officer carrying out what the representative told him to do. And in their tract Regal Tyranny Discovered in 1647, the authors railed not just against the monarchy of Charles I, but against monarchy itself. So they're an early public voice making very explicit arguments that monarchy itself has been inconvenient and intolerable and oppressive. The Levellers' representative, their legislature, would be re-elected annually to prevent its members growing corrupt or distant from the interests of the people. And the electorate of the representative was to be hugely expanded compared to the existing property and status-based franchises, comprising almost all adult men who were not servants or in receipt of arms, and royalists temporarily were going to be excluded from the vote, but not permanently, because the idea was that the events of civil war would recede behind them and the population would become more united, and there would be no need to exclude former royalists at that point. Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, a radical ally of the Levellers in the New Model Army, famously argued at the Putney debates of 1647 that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he. And therefore, truly, sir, I think it's clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first, by his own consent, to put himself under that government. And I do think that the poorest man in England is not bound in a strict sense to that government that he has not had a voice to put himself under. So this is a very radical argument, and in phrasing this argument, Rainsborough does seem to be influenced by things that Lilburne has already been saying in his pamphlets. There are some echoes in the phrasing. So individual men, of course, were to exercise their own judgment and consciences in picking the MPs who they trusted with their liberties. And individual religious conscience was to be protected too, under the Levellers' proposed constitutions. They wanted to protect religious liberty religious conscience from the powers of both state and church, with the national church existing just to teach sound Christian doctrine, but not able to enforce conformity to itself. On what grounds did the Levellers argue for such radical changes? We've seen how they radicalised Parliament's resistance theory and its arguments about the origins of power in the people. The Levellers really are using exactly the same arguments about original equality, liberty, and the need for consent to political power, but constructing a very different picture of political life from the more mainstream parliamentarians. The Levellers took the sovereignty of the people entirely seriously in the present day, rather than limiting it to the distant past. And they turned round the arguments of parliamentary absolutists like Parker, who said that Parliament could never act against the people because it represented them. The Levellers argued instead that precisely because Parliament represented the people, it had to be accountable to the people. But what about the other strand of resistance argument, the law and the ancient constitution? At first glance, it would seem unlikely that the Levellers needed or had time for this apparently nostalgic way of thinking about English liberties. And indeed, William Wallin was sceptical, including about Magna Carta, as we see here. In 1645, when the Leveller leaders first encountered each other, Lilburne was in prison, and in his writings defending himself, he used Coke and Magna Carta, arguing that Magna Carta was the best birthright the subject hath, and that it guaranteed law and justice. Wallin was a man of wider intellectual horizons than Lilburne in a way, and he issued a rebuke to him, which I've quoted from here. Wallin says that Magna Carta was but a part of the people's rights and liberties, being no more but what with much striving and fighting was by the blood of our ancestors wrestled out of the paws of those kings who by force had conquered the nation. He said it was so little as less could not be granted with any pretence of freedom, and it was so narrow in its provisions for freedom that it was only deceitfully and improperly called Magna Carta, indeed so called to blind the people. So much for it being the Great Charter that we saw Coke lionising earlier. Wallin even argued that Parliament, instead of fetishising Magna Carta, should legislate afresh. He complained that when they might have made a newer and better charter, Parliament have fallen to patching the old. This startling proposal, let's make a completely new Magna Carta, seems like another proof of Wallin's willingness to abandon history for measures based purely on reason and current necessities. But actually, the other Leveller leaders, who spent a lot more time in prison than Wallin ever did continue to appeal to Magna Carta and Coke's interpretation of it when they were defending themselves, as Lilburne does in this famous engraving, where you can see that the book he's holding, it says across it, Coke's Institutes, and that would have been the volume in which Coke presented his edition of Magna Carta. So why are Lilburne and Overton still appealing to Magna Carta, to the law, to the ancient constitution to a certain extent, even after Wallin has said, we really don't need to do this anymore? Was it just a cover for the novelty of what they were proposing? I don't think it was. Lilburne, who was nicknamed Freeborn John, had a strong and consistent view of what he thought were the rights and liberties of freeborn Englishmen, and freeborn Englishmen was an absolute catchphrase of his. He thought that by being born in England, and by definition that meant being born free, you would be blessed with a uniform package of rights and liberties and franchises and privileges that every freeborn Englishman had. And it was Coke's flexible and generous ancient constitution that guaranteed these rights to everyone that Lilburne thought everyone should be standing up to defend. Now, of course, he would have agreed with Wallin that these rights were also God-given, they were also natural, they were also in accordance with reason. But for Lilburne, the beauty of the English law was precisely that it was in harmony with these higher principles, or at least it was the way that he interpreted it. And remember that he was not a lawyer, he was very much self-taught and using it in the way that worked for him. The Levellers did end up doing something that was a bit like issuing a new Magna Carta. They adopted the idea of a document called an Agreement of the People. This was effectively an outline of key constitutional provisions and principles, perhaps a bit like the Body of Liberties, which Frank talked about in the previous talk, a first attempt at a written constitution for England. The concept of an agreement of the people was a striking one because the Levellers intended it completely literally. They wanted the agreement to be subscribed by people themselves as individuals in the same way that you might sign your name on a petition, so that the people themselves would actually be making explicit their consent to the establishment of this new or revised constitution. But I still think a lot of the time for Lilburne, the principles within that he would have regarded as principles which were already embedded in the English ancient constitution. They just needed urgent clarification and codification. So I'm now moving on to the brief final part of my talk, where we look at what happens after the execution of the king and after the end of the Leveller movement as well. The Levellers' anti-monarchical message and suggestions for alternative constitutional arrangements may well have paved the way for the execution of the king, which you see here in the background. There's Charles's head being held up, and the coming of the Republic. But these events did not take place in the way that the Levellers wanted, with the broad consent of the population. Instead, it was a military coup that purged the Parliament, thus leaving an even less representative Parliament than before, the so-called rump of the sitting Long Parliament. And it was that rump Parliament that was in charge of the country after the execution of the king, with a very improvised basic new constitution, simply removing the monarchy and the House of Lords and establishing a Council of State as an executive. Certainly, there were no new elections to refresh the legitimacy of the Rump's rule, and this was a parliament that had first been elected in 1640. We're now in 1649, and a lot has changed. The Levellers themselves were crushed after they started protesting against the illegitimacy of this new regime and its failure to implement their much more democratic vision. The unpopularity of the new regime among everyone from royalists and Presbyterians to radicals was vividly seen when they put Lilburne, the Leveller leader, on trial for treason, and he succeeded in talking the jury into acquitting him. He was, he had a certain popularity, and he also had a certain way with words when he was talking to the jury at his trial. So Lilburne's acquittal was a triumph celebrated by the London crowd with bonfires in the streets, but also celebrated in this medal, which really touchingly and evocatively records on the back the names of all of the members of the jury who acquitted Lilburne. So these are freeborn Englishmen. They have stood up for English liberty. But this was a small victory for the radicals. The new regime couldn't realistically hold free elections if it wanted to remain a republic. Public feeling was overwhelmingly royalist. Although the Rump Parliament remained in power until 1653, the problems of legitimacy that it had were never resolved, and neither did its successors manage to implement the kind of government by consent envisaged by the Levellers. Eventually, Oliver Cromwell became head of state as Lord Protector, and his constitution did include elected parliaments, but they weren't freely elected in that royalists were barred from voting, and the franchise was a property-based one, far from the much broader aspirations of the Levellers. The non-monarchical regimes of the 1650s needed propagandists, and there was a flowering of Republican literature, some of which was packaged and indeed paid for as propaganda by their regimes, some of which, however, and sometimes it's actually the same propaganda, which is both propaganda that is official propaganda for the regime, and in some of what it's saying, it's actually critiquing the regimes and undercutting their claim to be truly Republican. Republicans had an ideal of collective self-government and active citizenship, which had classical roots, but they also tended to stress that the citizen body should not necessarily include the mere rabble. And this is where you see again this kind of retreat from leveller radicalism. So John Milton, who you see on the left here, the future author of Paradise Lost, was a civil servant for the Republic, an official propagandist and pamphleteer during this period. He justified the execution of the king by talking very loftily about the right that the people always had to choose or change their governors, even if they weren't tyrants. So in some ways, he's very radical. He goes beyond resistance theory. Your king doesn't have to be a tyrant. You can just decide that you want a different government. And yet, he also despaired of the idolatrous, image-doting rabble, as he called them, who treated the Stuart monarchs like gods, and of the Presbyterian parliamentarians who had reneged on the promise of the revolution at the last minute, in his view. As the restoration of the monarchy loomed in 1660, Milton put his head above the parapet by publishing 2 editions of a pamphlet offering what he called a ready and easy way to keep England a republic and prevent the return of the monarchy. And in it, he was actually largely arguing against other Republicans. There were other Republicans who in 1659 had been saying, it's not too late, we can set up a really popular republic, perhaps with a single popular chamber like the Levellers had argued for, perhaps a 2-chamber elected legislature. And Milton in 1660 is saying, we cannot do any of this, it's not safe. He proposes a perpetual Senate composed of a virtuous elite sitting for life with no popular chamber to destabilize it. He insists that his single chamber legislature is a Senate, it's not a popular body. It's a world away from the Levellers' proposals for a much widened franchise and enhanced popular control of their representatives through annual elections. Now, that is at one end of the Republican spectrum. There were much more radical Republican constitutional ideas than those. And of course, Milton was proposing this at a moment of particular danger, and perhaps at more hopeful moments would have offered slightly more involvement to the people in governing their own country. Some Republicans actually did propose an annually elected single-chamber legislature. Marchmont Needham, who was a journalist, the editor of the government newsbook Mercurius Politicus that you see on the right here, he risked proposing constitutional change in the newsbooks. Once the new regime was fairly secure, he started saying, actually, we really need to have elections, which was obviously something that wasn't happening. And so his thoughts certainly had something in common with Leveller proposals, but it's not really clear what kind of franchise he had in mind for these elections. He asked his readers to bear in mind that by the people, he didn't mean the confused, promiscuous body of the people. He did, however, in quite a radical move, follow Machiavelli in saying that popular tumults, disorder could play a valuable role in checking excessive power on the part of government. But he was far from arguing, as the Levellers did, that this should be done by a self-conscious body of citizens aware of their own rights. I think he saw it as more of a popular reflex against mistreatment. But there are some echoes there with Leveller thought. The most complex and interesting Republican constitutional proposal of the 1650s was James Harrington's model for Oceania, a state transparently allegorizing Cromwell's England. Harrington described his ideal commonwealth as a popular government or democracy, a very early example of representative government being described in this way, although recent work by Marco Peltonen has shown that this was beginning to happen in the pamphlet literature of the Revolution. So Harrington was not the first, but he does propose a representative bicameral constitution, and he says, this is a democracy. But Harrington's main concern was to make his constitution stable and unbreakable, as he put it, immortal. So this was far from a government which could be swayed by the fickle passions of the mob. It was, in fact, a democracy with a good dose of aristocracy within it, embodied within a bicameral legislature, which Harrington regarded as absolutely essential for the safe functioning of his republic. In much of this talk, I've been talking about justifications for resistance against bad governors, and that kind of resistance might have issued in the overthrow of old constitutions. But Harrington's proposals get as far as addressing the problem from the other side. How do you defend your great new constitution against those who are trying to undermine it? It's worth saying that Harrington's work remained influential in the 18th century, and the US Constitution certainly owes some debt to it. Harrington believed that he had worked out a constitution which could safely embrace all. One of his disagreements with his fellow Republicans is that Harrington insists that it's perfectly safe to allow royalists to vote in his new Oceania constitution if it was set up. And this was because he believed that the balanced constitution he came up with was completely proof against factional sedition. He said, "No living man can show which way any man or men in or under it can contract any such interest or power as should be able to disturb the Commonwealth with sedition." So his constitution is so balanced that it will actually fulfill everyone's interests in very equal ways. So people won't actually have the motivation to rebel against it. But even if they had the motivation, again, the constitution distributes the power in such careful ways that no one would actually be able to successfully disturb the Commonwealth. Harrington's carefully calibrated constitutional detail doesn't have the same rhetorical force for a modern reader as some of the levelers' bolder appeals to the people to defend their liberties. But I'm finishing with it because Harrington's ideal of a state where faction could never take hold and the Constitution and the rule of law could be preserved forever is certainly a vision to reckon with, however illusory it may now seem to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was great. And you ended on a note that I wanted to ask you about first, which was, I mean, that was so fascinating. I'm going to have to watch the whole thing in the recording. And I see people are doing little claps in their reactions.
That's
There's
nice.
somebody saying phenomenal, bravo. Very nice. So, so much of this sounds contemporary. The battle
Mm,
between the sovereign or executive power and the people, and it just has such resonance today.
yeah,
Really
yeah.
interesting. So, um, so so let me see. Let me go through the questions. Um, well, here's the first one, which occurred to me, but then I'll go back. Um, Becky is wondering if the founding fathers of the US were familiar with leveler thought.
I think probably not directly. There's a bit of I don't know so much about the American side, but there's among leveler scholars there's a bit of debate about how well the levelers were known in England in the 18th century as well, because they are ultimately a movement of topical pamphleteers who are issuing quite short, potentially ephemeral pamphlets. They're not writing big treatises that people are then kind of going back to and reading. I think people have heard of Lilburne. Maybe he was in the 18th century. There's Lilburne was called Freeborn John. One of my colleague and acquaintance Ted Vallance has written a great article called Reborn John. Did people know about Lilburne in the 18th century? And he's tracing the ways in which they did. But there's a bit of dispute about whether the idea of levelers, when people used the term levelers in the 18th century, they probably weren't referring to this group of people. And some 18th century radicals did have copies of leveler pamphlets, and we know that. But whether that goes as far as the American founders, I would be a bit skeptical, I think. But so it's not that they're not quite coherent enough, and the levelers was a name given to them by their enemies, by the way. They're not quite coherent enough as a movement, and they're not producing quite fat enough texts to be sort of part of a canon, but radical people are still aware of some of their influence, I think.
I think the path, to me, the path goes through the Puritans in the early 17th century.
Mm,
So they come over here in the 1630s, 40s, 50s. They're going back and forth in the 40s and 50s. And so I think that that's where the influence comes in what
mm,
is established, particularly in New England, and then gets passed on. Because the language, say, in the Body of Liberties is so similar.
Hmm.
from Coke, all the ideas come through, and
Yeah,
I think the idea of a freeborn Englishman lasts absolutely,
yeah,
and is a major factor in the American,
yeah.
rights and liberties and being freeborn that lasts into the Revolution, definitely. So anyway, that's my interpretation. Um, this is uh, somebody asked whether the Magna Carta is used in the US as a government document. No, but the influence of the Magna Carta, I wonder if you can you say anything about that?
Um, I, I don't know. I'm very bad at taking the story on from where I am, from where I
Yeah,
actually specialize.
yeah. I'm sorry.
I
Yeah,
think that, but I mean, I think that sense of it being a crucial part of the idea of rule of law and it being just this totemic thing that you refer back to constantly, and and particularly the really critical chapters about people, not being deprived of their liberties, just or their freeholds, and justice not being deferred or delayed. It just underpins that whole idea of the rule of law, and it's so
yeah.
resonant in that way.
Yeah, it is mentioned over and over again by the Puritans, certainly, and
Yeah.
then by people in the Revolutionary era. Yeah. So another US related question, and then we'll get back to England. Uh, was Edward Coke the same man who helped Roger Williams attend the charter school?
Oh, I don't know. That's something I would need to
I
go away and
Me
I would need to
too.
go away and look up
Roger
John
Williams
Williams.
famously believed in freedom of conscience and religion.
Yes, yes,
So,
yeah. No, Williams and the Levellers are very, um, that you can put them in some ways in the same frame in terms of how they think about liberty of conscience in religion. Um, I mean, I think Williams is even clearer in saying that the state and the church are just completely separate realms. But the Levellers are essentially going in that kind of direction. And it's a little bit hard to know exactly. And again, Williams is just so splendidly clear that he really does mean everyone, any kind of religion. Um, whereas the Levellers are a little bit more. And of course, Williams doesn't mean that because he thinks everyone's going to be saved at the end. He thinks very few people are going to be saved, and
nice.
but in
Health in
this
his
in
way.
this world, you can interact civilly with all of these people of different religions. The Levellers are going some way down that same set of arguments. Um, they are a little bit more cautious about Catholics because they see them as a potential fifth column within the state. Um, um, and actually, interestingly, in terms of theology, they have a different kind of radicalism from Williams, or some of them do. Lilburne, not so much, probably at the time of the Leveller movement. Well, it's hard to know. He starts off um, as a very Calvinist Baptist who definitely believes in predestination, but Overton and Wallen are people who believe much more in um, perhaps not universal salvation, but that everyone is offered grace and can be saved. And so they've sort of moved beyond the strict Calvinist version of Puritanism, and a lot of the most interesting figures in this period, I think, have done that. So they
Mhm.
are very radical in terms of religious conscience, and they do believe people, different people have different insights from God and should be able to pursue them.
Yes, that is interesting. Let's see. So somebody just makes a comment that Roger Williams wrote a lot about the liberty of conscience, and that your lecture is helping her imagine the world in which he lived. So that's very nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
David asks two questions. How do the levelers deal with Christian justifications of authority? And he's citing Romans 13, fifth commandment applied politically. It doesn't sound like they are secularists. And a second question is, how do millenarian ideas play a role in these radical critiques?
Mhm.
Good question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, there's a whole radical world in the English Revolution that I haven't even touched on here. I'm sort of dealing with the more, in a way, the more kind of rationalistic and certainly less millenarian versions of it. You don't really get that millenarianism in the Levellers. I don't know whether they have any sense that that, by bringing about their new constitution, they are, they're moving a step closer towards the end of the world or not.
Right.
They don't frame it in those terms. They do, a lot of what they are arguing is very much motivated by the need to protect freedom of conscience in religion. And in that sense, the questioner is right that they're not secularists.
Mhm.
A lot of what they're proposing politically is probably actually designed to protect freedom of conscience in religion and set up a system that can do that. But I think in terms, because they do separate church and state quite a lot, they are quite secular in the way that they present their political theories.
Mhm.
Um, and they don't bring millenarianism in very much, and they're not as, I'm trying to think now whether they sort of bring in the providentialist ideas that you would constantly get in someone like Cromwell saying, we've got this great opportunity because God has given it to us. And they're not really saying that in quite the same way that Cromwell is constantly saying it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, in terms of the justifications of authority, I think really the parliamentarians and the resistance theorists have already done that work for them, explaining that you obey God before you obey man. And that's why, in spite of um, all of these arguments for obedience from the Bible, you actually are only obedient to the magistrate who really is a terror to evildoers. You're not obedient to the magistrate who isn't, who's actually on the wrong side. So I don't, I think that work's kind of already been done by the parliamentarians and the resistance theorists before them.
Mhm. I think that's an interesting idea that you're loyal to God before you're loyal to the magistrate, especially if they do something
Mm,
wrong. It's such a
yeah,
moral argument, and it's so applicable today. Very
yeah,
interesting. Yeah. Um,
yeah.
again, let's see. Do any of these radical critiques extend to critiquing authority within families, or is that taken as for granted?
Well, I hoped there would be a gender question because I realized I skipped over gender as well.
Yeah.
Um, um, I mean, there are a couple of things to say there. I mean, one of the things to say is that the levelers are not arguing for a complete adult male franchise. They, as I say, they do exclude servants, and servants are a kind of life cycle stage in early modern England. It's not that people are servants as a lifetime occupation, it's that they're servants when they're young people and then they move on and establish their own households.
Mhm.
And when we're thinking of the family and the structure of the family, you have to include servants as well as children and husbands and wives in that in early modern England. So in a sense, servants, they're living in someone else's household. They've got another household head. And that's why they're not enfranchised themselves. Having said which, I don't think it is purely household heads who are enfranchised because they do say adult men and over the age of 21 years. So if you were an adult male who was living at home with your father but was not their servant, you would have your own vote.
Mhm.
So that's already quite interesting. There's debate among historians. I mean, Anne Hughes says that the levelers are very much constructing an idea of kind of respectable male-headed households, and it's that male head of household who is the freeborn Englishman who goes out and does this. But there were women in the leveler movement. They were a lot of them were whose names we know were wives of the leveler leaders, but there are also people who were there's a woman called Catherine Chidley who wrote religious pamphlets in her own right and was a real leader among the leveler women. And they do things like they actually uh, in 1649, after the execution of the king, when Lilburne and the other leveler leaders have been picked up and put in the tower yet again, they do mass female petitions on behalf of their leveler colleagues. And they use very interesting language. They say things like, we have an interest in Christ equal unto men and a proportional share in the liberties of the Commonwealth, something like that.
Mhm.
Um, and they're also reported in the news books, the way that they present themselves as they go to Parliament and try and hand in this petition of women. And one of the news books reports that an MP comes out and asks them, comes out and says it's very strange that women should petition. And one of the women says, well, it was strange that you cut off the king's head, but I suppose you'll justify it. So, you get this sense that this is obviously a sympathetic news book, I think, that that reports that comeback.
Yeah.
Um, so, so women are acting as women within the leveler movement. they're saying things like, we can't stay at home and just look after our housewifery as you're telling us to, because you've just put our husbands in prison. So, what are we supposed to do? We just can't actually, stick to our role. And they're
Mhm.
not claiming that they've got exactly the same political rights as men, but they're certainly very much engaging with the cause. And again, we don't know exactly who wrote the Leveller women's petitions. We know that some individual ones presented in the names of Mary Overton, Richard Overton's wife, or Elizabeth Lilburne, Lilburne's wife. Some of those we know were actually written by the husband. I mean, in Lilburne's case, it's obvious that just you can't mistake Lilburne's style and his cramming in of his legal references and things. So they're partly used as theatre to demonstrate that the government is being brutal and is kind of brutalizing, destroying families, brutalizing women, because again, sometimes women are kind of dragged out of their houses, and there's a very dramatic description of that in one of Overton's pamphlets. Um, they don't get as far as actually making an argument against that authority within families, but Lilburne in one of his texts talks about Adam and Eve being kind of equal, and he segues from that into no one has power over another person except by consent, and he just doesn't explain how the power of husbands over wives comes about. He
Uh-huh.
goes from every individual, man and woman are originally equal, no one has power over one another except by consent, and then he just doesn't actually explain how it comes about.
Funny
So that,
about
yeah, there is that gap there.
that.
But I mean, it is really interesting that he kind of goes out of his way to mention Eve and to say men and women originally had that equality. So yeah, it's very interesting.
Once you start talking about consent, though, it is really the thin edge of the wedge. Where do you, so the question always comes up.
Mm, mm,
So a couple of observations here. One is that the pamphleteer Thomas Paine, who arrived in the 1770s here, must have been aware of the Levellers to be able to write common sense. And it's true, there are resonances. Another
yeah.
observation is the New England Puritans. Read the New England Puritans. Note that the second edition of Edward Winslow's Gorton, 1646, if I'm reading this correctly,
Hmm.
Hypocrisy Unmasked, was reprinted in 1649 under the title The Danger of Tolerating Levelers in a Civil State.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Uh-huh.
I mean, levelers literally meant people who, I mean, this was a slur against the levelers, implying that they were interested in leveling property.
Yeah.
So they were interested in destroying private property, which actually in their final agreement to the people, they say, no, 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 it's going to be absolutely illegal under the Constitution to destroy private property. They want to say that that's not us, that's not what we believe. And another group who I hadn't, again, had no time to touch on, the diggers, are the ones who are coming along and saying, actually, we want
Yeah.
to destroy private property. So so the danger of tolerating levelers may be referring to those kinds of ideas. And if it's 1649, the
General
diggers were already around. So yeah, but I will look up
There was
that.
a general horror of democracy among, at least John Winthrop writes about the terribleness of democracy. They'd all read
Mhm.
Plato. A final question. This is sort of long, which is New England thinkers were keenly aware of the resistance made to King Charles I as precedent, and he's citing Jonathan Matthews' influential 1750 sermon, which helped to shape John Adams' thought, and had
Mhm.
participated actively in the Glorious Revolution in the colonial context. So, along with other influences and experiences, e.g., the Great Awakening, would you agree with something like 1640 plus 1689 equals 1776?
I guess, I mean, I think everything sort of builds up a layer of stuff that the next generation can draw on. And then, and obviously also as this is kind of looking at the looking at this myself, looking at the comment myself, obviously also people don't live neatly through one just one revolution and then die before the next one comes along. People's life cycles and how they mesh with these kind of sequences of events is very interesting. So yeah, 1688, 1689 is very interesting, and people who were involved in the Glorious Revolution and before that in the exclusion crisis, some of them have cut their teeth during the English Revolution, and those ideas are carrying on. And they can't be expressed in quite the same way under the restored Stuart monarchy, but they are still there. And I think, yeah, everything creates layers of influence and layers of texts that can be drawn on by the next generation when they're needed, if they're still in circulation in some way. And even though I was playing down the radicalism of the Republicans, I think the Republicans are a route through which a lot of this thinking, people do still read. People do still read Harrington in the 18th century,
Mm.
Milton as well. Presumably, I mean, Milton's such an interesting case, but there's no time to talk about Milton.
But they all read Milton, yes.
Mm,
I mean, the just the radicalism of the thought, the departure from the past seems so dramatic to me. Am I
yeah,
reading this, or is
I think it. I think it is. And in a way, what I'm trying to do is just sort of show some of the materials are there. You can kind of start to see where it comes from, but in a particular moment of crisis. And again, as I said, the English Revolution really is a revolution, and you can see it having these kind of dynamics that revolutions have, where they radicalize themselves, and um, there's really interesting work being done by people on exactly how that works, and how people on the parliamentarian side are putting out stuff that's much more radical than the parliamentarian leadership themselves would approve of, and people who are kind of precursors to the levelers. Some of these ideas come up before the leveler movement. Um, and it's because in a revolution there are those opportunities and there are those power struggles within each side. Even when it's at the stage when it's still a civil war, it's such a fertile kind of environment that things develop, and what's sayable um, just changes so fast in that period. So I think it genuinely is extremely radical.
I'm wondering if we can ask you for a few reading suggestions.
Shall I send some things through for you to send out? Is that easiest?
Great. That would be great. Obviously,
Yeah,
we'll, but I think people would find that really useful.
yeah. I will send some things through.
Any other questions from anyone? There's a lot to take in here, and it is, new to most of us. I'm just going through the chat, make sure I've got everything. Somebody comments that the description of the Rump government as the Rump is particularly endearing and descriptive.
Yeah, it was also a great source of satire, because the Rump Parliament came back briefly in 1659, and was very, very unpopular by that stage. But there's an actual sort of set of episodes called the Roasting of the Rump, where people go out on the street and roast rumps of meat and throw them at people who they think are supporters of the Rump Parliament. So there's lots of people have lots of fun with this.
I just have one, sorry, this is a question I should have asked in the beginning, but how much of the basis of the support of the levelers was artisans? And so therefore either apprentices or artisans and sort of in urban areas.
I think there's a lot of that. I mean, I think it's really the people, as I say, the people who migrate to these kind of congregationalist churches outside the national church are a key source of support. And when they're collecting signatures for petitions, they're literally just sort of going along to these gathered churches and getting everyone there to sign their names on it.
Uh,
Um, but yeah, I mean, Lilburne and Overton are that kind of apprentice sort of age, and those are the kind of um, circles that they move in. And apprentices are this very mobilizable, body of potentially politicized people. So I think there is a lot of that happening, and it is quite urban, but perhaps it would be harder for us to know if the influence is spreading out through pamphlets that people are reading in other places other than the army and in London.
mm. So, I mean, there's a big question about class here and which
Mm.
class is being represented, so which we don't have time to touch on. One last question. Let's see, how does the British events, no, wait, this must be a typo. The British
Holland
events.
is, yeah, I'll say one very brief thing about
Oh,
Holland, which is
Holland,
that they
yes.
that they of course were a republic but a republic that had a very prominent family in the Orange family. And Holland had quite weird reactions to England executing their own king. There's a book called The Royalist Republic talking about the Dutch hostility to the English having executed a king who's related to the House of Orange. So and the English end up at war with the Dutch in the early 1650s. And again, there are some strange, there are complicated discourses around that, because there are definitely people saying, look, they're Protestant, they're a republic, we should be allies with them, we're doing the same thing as them. But actually, of course, they are commercial rivals, and so the potential for them to be allies doesn't really get fully realized.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Yes. He's touching on something which is the horror of the execution of a king spreads
Mm.
across Europe, does it not?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, so you've got some really great job. Thank you for staying up late to present. Truly outstanding. Such rich information. Great presentation. Looking forward to seeing the reading list. People are really happy about your presentation. So thank you, Rachel. I want to say just a few words before you go. I know everybody's probably wants to go to dinner and you want to go to bed, no doubt. But it was absolutely brilliant presentation. Thank you. I love those levelers. They were fearless. They really kept on. And thank you to everybody here for joining us. And if you enjoyed this presentation as well as others during this year that we've offered, please do donate. Yesterday, I did a back of an envelope calculation and realized that for each registration on Eventbrite, we receive an average donation of $1.15, which has been okay up to now because we had two major donors, but we've lost those two donors because of cuts from the federal government and the knock-on effects. And I have to say that we won't make it through 2026 if we're only averaging a dollar donation per person signing up. So please do donate. We don't have an office. We don't have paid staff. We don't have overheads aside from all the tech platforms. We don't charge for our events, but if you want to see us carry on, then we do need your support. We want you to enjoy our programs for 2026. And what we have coming up, just so you know, we have music and musicians in the English Civil Wars, and that will include music played by the presenter. We have a discussion of a 17th century royalist conspiracy theory and kind of smear campaign against a New England Puritan, Hugh Peter. And then from March through May, we have a really important multi-part series on King Philip's War, which we're calling Metacom's Resistance, as it offers an indigenous point of view of what was per capita the bloodiest conflict in US history in the 17th century. So join me again for thanking Rachel for a really fabulous, illuminating presentation, and I will see you all in January. Okay, thank you again.